Hi everyone and welcome to a new video on the CBI channel. In this tutorial series we're creating a Django and React dashboard/charting app in which we visualize database data inside of our React JS frontend. This is not the first video. We've already done 4 before in which we've set up our Python Django backend and our React JS frontend. We've enabled page navigation and created a responsive navigation menu, and we've created our database model and imported some data that we can work with. In this video, we're going to continue and we're going to bring our data from our backend database to our React.js frontend so that we can actually use it right there. Now on the picture on the screen right now, you can see how that is going to work. Currently, our data is stored in the SQLite database inside of our backend, following the structure that we've defined in the last video in our models.py file. Now what we need to do in our backend is create an API that can be picked up by our frontend to get the data. To do that, we first need to create a view and a URL. The URL is going to be the actual endpoint that we need to make a connection to from the front end. And in the view, we're going to define exactly what we want to bring to the front end. The next crucial part that is going to make sure that everything works together with the URL and with the view is the serializer, because a serializer is going to make the translation from our SQLite database to a JSON format that our front end can actually read. So by creating a view, a serializer, and a URL, we can expose an API that our frontend can pick up. Now in the frontend, we're going to use Axios to make a request to the backend URL and actually get the data available inside of our JSX pages. Now there are a few steps that we're going to take to realize that. We're going to start by creating the backend API by creating that serializer, view set, and the URL. Then we're going to inspect if we can see the data in the URL of our backend. Next, we will be making some installs in our frontend to fetch the data, which is Axios. And then we're going to create a data fetching component with Axios so that we can have a reusable method for getting the data from our backend. Then we're actually going to get the data from our backend and see if we can see it in our frontend. And as a last step, we're going to be making some modifications to our serializer to get data from the foreign key tables as well. Now, an important component for making sure that we can create APIs in Django is Django REST Framework. This is the flexible and powerful toolkit for building web APIs in Python. Now, we have already installed Django REST Framework into our project and added it to our settings.py file. So if you've not done that, please make sure that you have this ready in your project. Now, the first steps that we're going to take is make sure that we have our view, our serializer, and our URL ready in the backend. Now, the first thing that we need to start with is the serializers, because that's going to define from what model we're going to get data, also which attributes we want to bring from the front end to the backend. And it is the mechanism that makes the translation between the SQLite database and the JSON format that our front end wants to receive. So inside of our backend folder and then the data folder, we're creating a new file, which is going to be called serializers.py. And in here, we're going to define the serializer that is going to bring our supermarket sales data from the backend to the frontend. So on the top, we're going to start with some imports. And the first one is from REST_framework. We're going to be importing serializers. Next, we're also going to import the models that we want to bring to the front end. So I'm just going to do from.models and then import all by using the asterisk. Then we can actually define the serializer, and we can say that the class of supermarket sales serializer is going to be equal to serializers.model serializer. Now, after that we've declared this class of the supermarket sales serializer, we need to define a few details in the class meta. Now, the first thing that it wants to know is from which model do we want to bring data from the backend to the frontend. And in our case, that is going to be from the model of supermarket sales. So we're going to put as a model the supermarket sales. Next, we also need to identify which of the fields we actually want to take into the frontend. Now in here, I want to take the ID, and I also want to take all of the other fields that we have defined, which are these right here. So just for convenience, I'm going to quickly paste them in here and then just comment them out. so that we can see what we need to add, which is unit price. We also have the quantity and the date. And then we have the country, the gender, the customer type. And let's put it in those parentheses. And also the branch that we have listed down, the product line. And as a last one, we will have the payment. Now you can always include or exclude all of the fields that you need, but in this case, I'm just going to get all of them. And I realized that I just have typed all of the fields out because that is what I like to do. But if you just want to get all of them and don't type everything out, there's actually a much easier way to do it. So let me just quickly show you. You can also just do some parentheses and then underscore, underscore, all, underscore, underscore. And this should make sure that all of the fields are going to be listed down in our serializer. But for now, I'm just going to get all of the fields manually so that I can always exclude them by simply deleting them later. So now our serializer is complete. And the next thing that we can then create is a view, which is going to make sure that we have the right information brought to our front end. Now for views, I always like to use Django REST Framework's view sets, because that allows you to use one single class with multiple commands in there to do different things. So one view set for example, our supermarket sales can have different functions in there for getting a list of all of the different view sets through the def list, but also for creating view sets for the function of create, retrieving a single one, updating one, or even do partial updates and destroys. So this is a really convenient way to just have one class that can then do all of the different operations that you would like. Now, in this case, we want to get a list of all of our supermarket sales. So we're going to create a view set and then use the function of list to get a list of all of the sales. So back to our project, and we can go to the views.py file. And on the top, we're going to start with a few imports. Firstly, we're going to do from REST underscore framework, and we're going to be importing view sets, which we will use to create the view, and then also permissions. Then we also want to import everything from our serializer that we've just created. So we do from.serializers and then import all. And we're going to do the same thing from .models, because we also want to get all of our models in here. Then we also want to make sure that we can have responses. So we do from REST underscore framework and then dot response. And we're going to import response. And now we have everything that we need to create our view set. So we're going to define a class, and that class is going to be called supermarket sales view set. And in there, we are going to refer to viewsets.view set with the two capitals for the view set. Then we need to define some information. And the first one is the permission underscore classes. And permission underscore classes refers to who can actually see the data from this view set. Now, in this case, we're going to use permissions.allow any. Next, we're going to be defining the query set that we want to bring. And the query set is going to be equal to our model of supermarket sales. So we do supermarket sales.objects.all, like this. And then as a last step, we can also define which serializer class we want to use. So it's serializer underscore class. And that is going to be equal to the serializer that we've just created. And the name of that is the supermarket sales serializer. So we're going to specify that one right there. Next, we can define the function for listing down all of the different supermarket sales. So we can do a def of list, and in there we specify self and request. Now, again, here we need to specify some information. First of all, we're going to specify the query set again, and query set is going to be equal to the same thing what we've defined here, supermarket sales.objects.all. Then we also want to define the serializer. And the serializer is going to be equal to self.serializer class, which is referring to this one right here. And we're going to open that up and then state that we want to have query set as the query set, and then say that many is true. Now what we do right here is we're going to indicate that the data that we want to serialize with our serializer is going to be all of the data from the supermarket sales, and that there can be many records. So we say many is true. Then as a last thing, we also need to return something to our front end in the end, or to the API. And we're going to be returning a response. And inside of that response, we want to bring the data. So we can say serializer.data is what we actually want to bring to our API request. So now in our view set, we have specified what we want to bring to the front end. And we've also in here specified how we want to serialize this so that it can be read by the front end. Now, the last thing that we still need is an actual URL that is going to contain all of this information and that we can actually get the data from inside of our front end. Now, inside of the urls.py file, we're going to use a little bit of a different method of establishing URLs. What I explained earlier inside of this view set documentation is that there can be different functions for the different activities that you want to do within your view set, which means that also that for each of these functions, you would likely need to create a separate URL. Now you can all define that by yourself, but you can also let Django automatically create the URLs for all of the different actions that you have defined inside of your view set. So instead of creating one URL yourself for list, one URL yourself for create, and so on and so on and so on, we can make sure that we define a single URL, and then Django in the background automatically creates different URLs for these different things. Now we can do that by using the REST framework routers to get routes instead of the URLs. So we're going to delete this one for now, and we're going to do an import of from REST underscore framework.routers. And then we're going to import the default router. And then we can say that router is going to be equal to default router. And then underneath the router, we can do router.register, which we use to register the different routes. So right now we only have one view for which we need to create a URL, which is the supermarket sales view set. So I can say in this route that I want to create a specifically one for the supermarket sales, which is going to be the extension where we can find the data. And then we can say that we want to get URLs for all of the different functions inside of the supermarket sales view set. So on the top, we can do from.views import all, and then say that we want to create routes for supermarket sales for the supermarket sales view set. And then we also can specify a base name for how we're going to call it, and that's going to be the same. It's going to be supermarket sales. So what this router now will do is for every function that we have listed underneath this view set, it is going to generate a URL where the extension is always going to start with supermarket sales. Now the last thing that we need to do is then also put this in URL patterns. So we do URL patterns, and we say that it's going to be equal to router.urls, which is just going to be equal to everything above here. And then we can save this. And by making these changes to our views, our URLs, and serializers, we've now successfully created an API that makes the data for supermarket sales available under the extension of supermarket sales. So let's open a terminal and actually check out the result. So we can cd into our backend and activate our virtual environment with venv/scripts/activate. And then we can start our server with python manage.py run server. And now let's start our server and see what we see. Okay, and we now started our server, and you can see that we have in our API route one extension available for supermarket sales, which we can find in this URL right here. And if we go there, we can see that we actually have an error, and that is because I have not specified the fields attribute inside of our serializer, which I have done, but without the S. It needs to be fields. So let's save this and try again. And now we can see that our data actually shows up in this URL. And you can see all of the details that we have right here. So now that we've successfully created our backend API and we have an endpoint ready that is going to provide us with the data, we need to make sure that our frontend can actually get it from there. Now, to help us with fetching the data from that URL, we're going to be using Axios. And Axios is a client that can make the request to our backend and then get the data to our frontend. So the first thing we need to do is install that package by using npm i Axios. So in our code, we open a new terminal and this time we cd into the frontend. And in there, we do npm i Axios. And just like that, the install is complete. Now we're going to create a reusable component that can make requests to our backend URLs so that we can later on use the data in our frontend. So in our code, we go to the frontend folder to source and then to components. And in here, I'm creating a new file called axios.jsx. And in here, we're going to write the method for fetching the data. So we're going to start by importing Axios from Axios, which is the package we've just installed. And then we can define the function that's going to get the data in a constant. So we can say constant Axios instance, which is just the name of our function. And then we can say that it's equal to axios.create. And then we can open some round brackets and some squirrely brackets in here. Now the Axios instance wants to receive a few parameters so that it can determine where it needs to get the information from and also some of these settings for getting the data. So the first thing it wants to know is the base URL, which we need to specify like this. Now in here, we want to have the base URL of our backend. And if we go to the terminal where our backend is hosted, you can see that it's going to be this HTTP 127.0.0.1 and then the port of 8000. Now to pass that into our Axios instance, I'm going to define a constant called myURL on the top here and just set that equal to this address, which we can just copy over and paste it in here. And now we can set the base URL equal to my URL. The next thing it would like to know is the timeout. And we're going to set a timeout of 5000 milliseconds, which is going to make sure that our request has a little bit of a delay because otherwise it goes too fast. Then it also wants to know the headers that it needs to send to our backend. And in there, we specify two subparameters. The first one is content type. And we're going to set that equal to application/JSON. Next, we also need to define something called accept. And in there, it's going to be exactly the same as in content type because it's again going to be application/JSON. And just like that, we have defined the instance that can get the data from our backend. Now we want to use this in another file, so I need to export it. So we can do export default and then Axios instance. And now we can use this in multiple files in the future to fetch the data from our backend. So now let's actually fetch some of the data from our backend that we've just created in our dashboard1.jsx file. Now the first thing we need to do is make some additional imports. So on the top next to React, we're also going to be importing something called useState and also useEffect. And I will explain later on why we will need that. Next, we also need to import our Axios instance that we have just created so that we can make the request to the backend. Now, the first thing that we want to do is actually get data from the backend. So we're going to create a constant and we're going to be calling that get data, but it can be whatever name you want. And then we do an equal sign and some round brackets. And after that, we do an arrow function with some squirrely brackets. And in there, we define exactly what we want to do to get the data. Now we are going to be using our Axios instance right here, and we're going to add a .get because we're going to get data from the backend. Now to actually get data, we need to do some backwards commas and then provide the extension where we can find the data. Now inside of our Axios instance, we have already set a base URL right here. And since we've done that, we only need to define what is after the base URL. Now, if we go to the actual API, you can see that we need to go to supermarket sales because that's what follows after the localhost base URL. So that is exactly what we will do. I'm going to copy over the supermarket sales and then put that inside of our dashboard one in the get one. Now, of course, this gets the data from the backend, but we then need to do something with it. So what we can add to this is a .then statement. And let's put that on the next line. And this is going to define what we're going to do with the data that we receive. Now in here, we can add some round brackets, and in there we specify res. And then after res, we do an arrow function like this. And res is just the name for whatever we get right here. Now, once we have this data, we actually want to put it inside of a constant, because then we can use that constant to display the data inside of our application. So let's first get that constant. So I'm going to create a constant called my data, and we can then populate that constant by using set my data, and that is going to be equal to use state. And by default, this is just going to be an empty list. Now, by setting it up this way and using useState, we can use the setMyData function to change the myData constant. So what we can do in here to make sure that our data is available in the myData constant is use setMyData. And in there, we can define res.data. And this is going to get that data and put it in myData through setMyData. Now, the last thing we need to also determine is when we actually want to trigger this getData function. And to do that, we use useEffect. So we can say useEffect right here, and then do some round brackets, and then some round brackets again. And after the first complete set of round brackets, we do another arrow function. And in there, we can define getData, and then with some round brackets right there. And then after this square bracket, we're going to do a comma and then an empty list. And what this means is that we're only going to do the getData function whenever we first get on our dashboard one page. It's not going to do any other requests after that, because for me, it's fine to just have that initial one there. So let's save this. Now this should successfully get our data and get it to our front end. Now to check that, I'm going to just do a console.log of my data, and I'm going to call that also my data, so that we can actually see in our front end if we get anything from our backend. Now let's start the front end server by doing npm run dev and go to the dashboard one page to see if data appears in our console. So we are now on the dashboard one page, and if I do a right click and do inspect, and I go to our actual console, you can now see that we have an array of 1,000 records being ready for us. And you can see all of the data that we have from our backend, which is now inside of our front end. So this is working just fine. Now, what we do see inside of our console is that the majority of the data still shows the primary key, because it is linking to different tables. But I actually want to get the name of these fields, because showing a 1 on the screen is not going to make sense to my users. So let's make sure that we have that as a last step. So we are back in our code, and let's now make sure that no longer the foreign keys are going to be visible inside of our front end, but the actual name that we've defined in the models.py file for all of these submodels. So to do that, we need to go to our backend code and then to our serializers.py file, because here we're going to change the way that the data is serialized. And we're going to start with an example for the gender column. So what we can do above the class meta is redefine the way that gender is going to be presented to our front end. And we can say serializers.slug related fields. Now in there, we need to specify a few things. The first thing that we need to specify is the actual query set that we want to retrieve. And the query set is going to be gender.objects.all, because this is the foreign key table from where we want to get the right value for the gender. Then next, we also need to define the slug field. And the slug field basically defines the column that we want to return. Now in this case, if we go to our models.py file, the gender table has the name attribute. So that's the one that I want to retrieve from there. So in the slug field, I'm going to say that we want to get the field of name. And now let's save this and see in our front end what value we now see for gender. So we are back in our front end. And if I now inspect the dashboard one page and I go to our console, you can see that the data is still here. But if I now open one of these records, you can see that we actually see the label of gender and no longer the foreign key. So this seems to be working just fine for us. Now we can do the same thing for the other ones. So we can just copy this one over and we can define that we want to see the same thing for the country, but then it just changes to country.objects.all. And you can reiterate this for all of the different values that you would like to get inside of your frontend. So for customer type is going to be exactly the same. You can of course switch the fields that you would like to return in the frontend. Now, as a last one, I'm also going to get it for the branch and then also change branch here. And if we save this and we go to our front end again, we will see inside of the console that we get a lot more usable information. But of course, we first need to refresh this page before it actually shows us the new data. So we can go to my data right here. And if we now open it up, you can see that it's branch A, country is the Netherlands, customer type is the member, and the gender is the female. So this makes much more sense for our users. And that is how we can get those more normalized column names inside of our frontend. And that is actually all that we're going to be doing for today. In this video, I showed you a mechanism to get your database data from the backend available inside of your React JS frontend. In the next video, we're going to continue and we're going to be experimenting with some charts from Material UI so that we actually can start building a nice looking dashboard inside of our frontend. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.